have the honor to have David Neumark speak to us today, and your co-authors up there on the screen.
There, she's up there.
Hi, welcome.
Thank you.
But the title is really intriguing. Do minimum wages reduce job opportunities for Blacks? Question. Go ahead, man.
All right, thank you. Thanks for coming. This is, I think, my third seminar in 3 years. I gave one that was kind of heavy-duty econometrics. Is that too loud or is that good? One was all this machine learning stuff. This one's really simple. This is like running up the middle on 3rd and 1 for those who know the football analogies. But you can see what the title is. I've been to some seminars here where I feel like people are gratuitously name dropping the name Milton Friedman, but I think in this case it's really appropriate, and you'll see what I mean in a minute. Anyways, so this is part of my ongoing addiction to minimum wage research, and we take on this question of race differences and effects of minimum wages. It doesn't have to come out of this motivation, but this is kind of what got me thinking about this. There's been this growing research literature as well as advocacy, and on this topic, these things often go hand in hand, basically arguing that higher minimum wages close the race gap in earnings or in wages. Now, obviously, that's not that interesting a question, conditional unemployment. Blacks earn less than whites, and you raise the minimum wage, and you only look at people who have jobs, the wage gap, presumably is going to be narrower. But nonetheless, one of these papers is published in the QJE, so make of that what you will. Starts from the premise, not a lot of evidence, a little bit. There's nowhere negligible employment effects, which is how some people summarize the literature. And then, as I said, not surprisingly, you get this narrowing of the race gap. And this has started to, this argument on minimum wages has started to, I think, permeate policy debate. Just in terms of this paper and its conclusions, it's based on data from the 60s. The 60s is a nice period because there were these big expansions. So it was kind of this big, we had the minimum wage went up and the number of workers it covered went up a lot. So it's a nice period to study. On the other hand, it's also 60 years ago, so not as relevant to what goes on today. Even in another paper by Martha Bailey and co-authors, just kind of doing the same thing concurrently. They have the same result for wages, but they point out there is some job loss, a little more severe for Blacks than for whites, that offsets this to some extent. I find their paper more convincing, although it's quite similar. Anyways, and I would argue, and I'll just say this, I don't want to go into the minimum wage debate, but I'll just show this one slide, which you've already seen, and don't try to read the stuff on the left-hand side. I'll just tell you what the picture says. This is just, the premise that minimum wages don't reduce jobs just isn't supported by the research literature. This is just a survey we did of all the sort of state level or less than state level panel data kind of studies, diff and diff, whatever. Since the early 90s, when people started doing this, we take the preferred estimates from the papers. We actually surveyed the authors and made sure we identified the same preferred estimates. These are the estimates, zero, you can see the zero line, these are elasticities. So the mean and median are about minus 0.1 to minus 0.2, which is par for the course. They're darker when they're more significant. The only way you can look at this literature and say minimum wages don't reduce employment or raise it is by ignoring most of the research. Now you might, because you might think it's wrong, and that's a topic I talked about previously, so I won't get into that. But so I say I think the question of the minimum wage effects by race is interesting, and surely shouldn't just look at this conditional unemployment.
How much is about Blacks as opposed to them?
None. There's almost nothing. It is amazing. So I don't know how many studies are in this thing, but there's roughly 200 U.S. studies, I think, since the early 90s or so of minimum wages. I think actually, except for the two I talked about, which are mainly focused on wages, none are explicitly motivated by the race question. There's only a couple more that have anything on this topic, which is kind of amazing. I think it wasn't the core reason we wrote the paper, but I thought it would be interesting, whatever the answer was. Oops, did I go the wrong way? No, sorry, I did go the wrong way. I just make one more point, and this question about when we take account of employment effects and not just wage effects, we could get a different answer, a more striking answer, if the effects are more diverse for Blacks. Was there a question? No, okay. Okay, so to Elena's question, there's very little on this. Washer and I have a little stuff on race, but it's kind of buried in a sort of very different question about minimum wages and EITCs. The most direct paper is Don Deere and Murphy and Welch have an AEA papers and proceedings thing back in the early stages of this debate. They're just sort of using blacks versus whites as kind of a third level of differencing. The federal minimum wage goes up. We know it's hard to infer anything from a federal increase. They say, well, blacks must have been more affected by whites, and lo and behold, their employment falls relative to that of whites. So that's one episode and some evidence in this direction. That's about it. At the same time, there's a ton of work that says when you look at, if you do standard minimum wage employment kind of analysis, as you zoom in on the less skilled, and it's usually because of the data defined in terms of age or education, sometimes in terms of industry, but that may not be skill rather than just wages. Well, who knows? But mainly age and education, the results, the minimum wage effects are more adverse. So might we expect this for blacks as well? They have lower observable skills. I'll show you that. And potentially lower unobservable skills. And they may be undervalued because of discrimination, which from the point of view of this analysis is essentially the same as having lower skill in at least in a Becker employer type of model, employer discrimination kind of model. So Friedman had this is a 1966 op-ed in Newsweek. I am convinced that the minimum wage law is the most anti-Negro law on our statute books. I don't know why the most, but anyways, that's not the point. But he was obviously talking about exactly this issue, right? You have a group that is lower wage, and you now say you can't hire anyone below wage X, and it's higher than some people's wages. It's going to affect them more adversely.
Well, I guess that a lot of 1950s labor legislation, unions, and I'm guessing the group that had that goal, keep blacks out of the union labor force.
Right. So I think in the union setting, Ray Marshall was the one who sort of broke a lot of that evidence that was part of it. And I've seen this argument made about minimum wages. When I hinted at this in our classic liberalism seminar a month ago, I don't know, it was David Henderson or somebody else mentioned some labor history that claims that. I sort of went back and forth of whether to put this in or not. The problem is I can find a historian that says this, but to really assess it is. I was worried when you get out of your own area of expertise, and you can sort of find something to support what you say, but there may be a lot more written. But yeah, people have certainly argued this. That, with the Great Migration to the north, which was a lot of black labor. It was lower skilled, and obviously they could push down wages. It would have been rational, and some people talk about that. But I think it's fair to say that, unless I'm really crazy, that's not the motivation now. Right. So, I don't think anyone advocating for higher minimum wages is coming from that perspective, even though, as I'll show you, it's kind of what's happening. Okay. So the core goal of this paper is to estimate employment effects of minimum wages for blacks as compared to whites. As I said, it's a very simple paper. Let me summarize the conclusion, just so you know. Some of you have to leave also. When you look at blacks, essentially what happens is I'm not surprised. I guess I might have found no significant differences. That wouldn't have surprised me. I wouldn't have been surprised if I found some evidence of somewhat more adverse for blacks, and more adverse effects for blacks than whites. The answer is you really can't find anything for whites, and all of the job loss is falling on blacks. I'm going to show you. Think of this basically, it'll get fancier, for whatever reason, but separate regressions for blacks and whites. And whites, the estimates are near zero. They're probably generally negative, but very small and insignificant. The black estimates are quite large. The elasticities for blacks are sometimes as large as -0.3 or higher. These are going to be different low-skilled groups defined on age, education, or both. And it suggests that, and this is why I find this so surprising, this seems A, important, and B, hard to believe we've missed. Now, maybe I'm wrong, and other papers will, it's the first paper that's really looking at this systematically, so I don't want to get on a soapbox until it's been vetted a bit more, but at least at this point, it's pretty striking. It's also true that the wage elasticities, they're harder to estimate in the data we use, but the wage elasticities are smaller than the employment elasticities, which suggests that earnings of blacks actually fall, right? It's not just that there's some job loss, but earnings actually fall, and we actually confirm that directly. And I should say, I don't say it here, but I say it at the end, all of this is a little worse for black males than for black females. Although those results are probably not generally statistically significant. So I think it's surprising. I think the policy implications for thinking about race differences in employment are pretty dramatic and probably controversial, which is why I'm getting all the feedback I can, although we have put this out as a working paper after beating it up for 9 months to see if we really believe the answer, and we do. We also have this other dimension of the paper, which I was actually another part of the motivation originally, because I have an urban economics sort of hat I wear sometimes as well. This turns out not to matter much, but there's still a real interesting angle to it. So residential racial segregation is extensive in the US. I'll show you a figure later. For those who don't know the numbers, it's pretty striking. So one possibility is there are more adverse effects for Blacks because of where they live. It's more about where they live than who they are, or the color of their skin. So we run a series of models that try to test that, essentially looking for interactions with the share Black in the neighborhood, which for us is going to be Pumas. We look at that, and you know, why might we find something? So, poverty, you know, race is very. There's a lot of segregation in race. As a result, there's a lot of segregation on poverty. More so for Blacks than for whites, actually. Different businesses can have different margins, different sensitivity to the minimum wage. You know, think about like the food deserts literature and these kind of things. You can imagine there's fewer substitutes in poor neighborhoods. So Marshall's laws might imply product demand is less elastic. So maybe, you know, maybe the minimum wage effects are weaker in those areas. We don't know. There could be more product market concentration. I always have trouble thinking through this, all this work on monopsony. I'm still having trouble often figuring out whether people are talking about labor market concentration or product market concentration and the measures they use. Another issue for another day. There may be selection of lower productivity Blacks into the areas with a high share Black. There may be more spillovers. I have work on racial stratification of networks. So if Blacks are losing jobs in areas with a lot of Blacks, then others don't find jobs. Who knows? Possible offset is if employers actually want to substitute away from Blacks towards whites when the minimum wage goes up because they undervalue them or they are less valuable. That's easier to do in a place with a low share Black than a high share Black. If you're in a highly Black area, you can't really substitute towards whites very easily. So those are all the motivations for looking at that. And let me just summarize because it's not there. We don't really find much in terms of spatial differences, like the effects on whites and the effects on Blacks are very similar in very white areas and very Black areas. But that doesn't imply that the minimum wage doesn't have different effects across space. Why? Because the effects fall on Blacks and Blacks live in Black areas. So this job loss and the white areas have, you know, the 10th percentile white, 10th percentile Black is like 2-point-something% Black. So it's almost, I'm only talking whites and Blacks here. So those are very white areas. So there's almost no job loss, even though the Blacks there experience the same effects. They're really concentrated in Black areas, and because of their skin color, that is where the race difference is occurring. So real quick on data, we use the ACS because we get big samples, and because we have the spatial dimension, I wanted to have some geographic variation within states. We leave out Hispanics in this paper. You know, if referees make us, we'll put them back in, or not back in, we'll put them in. I'm a little concerned about informal work and how that responds to the minimum wage, and that being a whole other level of complication and knowing what people's status is. I think it's an interesting question. I'm just trying to, I always advise students, you know, take on too controversial issues, you're just giving yourself an increased chance of getting your paper rejected. Because it's one thing, you know, I only need one thing not to like to reject the paper. And I think this is more than important enough on its own without getting into that issue. What's important here? We use Pumas because in the public use data, you can identify them. A Puma, for those who don't know, they're typically about over 100,000 to 200,000 people. So they're a lot bigger than tracts. Tracts are, think about 5,000 people. They're smaller than cities and big cities. But they respect county and tract borders, and it's what you have. You can go to the confidential data and of course get tracts, which is probably too small for what we want to do. So this is what we've done for now.
Do you know tenure on the job before they become unemployed? And one thing I wonder is whether, you know, if you're a firm and they raise the minimum wage, then you start laying off workers, and typically it's last in, first out.
Right.
You know, and whether how some of this could be related to that.
Right, so it's ACS data, so we don't know much. We know race, gender, marital status, kids, age, education, where they live, where they work. Yeah, you don't, there's nothing longitudinal, nothing even retrospective about that. But you're right, and blacks, I will show you, blacks are a lot younger than whites on average, so you would imagine that's, to some extent true.
Yeah.
And that probably lower employment.
You could just
Over time.
compile, from the CPS, just, obviously not linked to this, but just as an idea.
Just from the tenure
of-
supplements.
For these kinds of people, how long is their tenure on the job?
Right. I will bet you it's generally very, I mean,
No,
very-
So my point
yeah,
is
you're right. Right.
that it might be a feature,
Mhm.
a characteristic of Black workers.
No, it's a good point.
rather than discrimination specific.
Right, agreed. No, that's a good point. That's a good point. Yeah, and we can see, I can measure tenure in the CPS tenure supplements by state, but that's fine, and by race, obviously. I can't see who's losing jobs in these data, but you're right, it's a good point.
So how do you reconcile your findings with this data compared to the literature that used the 1960s data and found more positive effects?
Well, I mean, there are positive effects on wages. So I mean, first of all, I'm not that concerned with reconciling from data 60 years old, but to the extent, I mean, so the Duranoncourt and Montalier paper and the Bailey, DiNardo, and I can't remember their authors at the moment, paper, they do almost the exact same thing. I remember these papers circulating at the same time with quite different answers. The Bailey et al. Paper uses as its employment measure, this is census data. So it's using any time employed last year and the other paper uses employed last week. And their argument is that employed last week is a much noisier measure. So I kind of buy that argument. I don't really know, but I'm not sure there's a reconciliation needed anyways, because they do find some job loss, but we put a lot more, scaffolding on the question. Yeah, Brian?
With going with Pumas as opposed to aggregating into CZs or some other geographic unit?
Well, so CZs are defined based on what's it called, commuting, right? It's like a sufficiently large share of people live and work in the same area. We're trying to get at racial segregation. So commuting zones have nothing to do with racial segregation, nor do Pumas. But I think at least the measurement I mean, I'm not sure comparing share Black across CZs is really what we're after here. I mean, there'll be some variation, but probably largely the state variation at that point. Okay. Wages are not central to the analysis, but just for the labor economists in the room, one of the things we don't like about the ACS is there's no hourly wage questions, right? There's an annual earnings, there's weeks in categories, and there's hours. We do some work with wages because I want to talk about binding us to the minimum wage, and I want to talk about wage elasticities. We have this sort of long, interesting only to labor economist section about how we try to clean up the ACS data. And it turns out, it looks like a non-negligible, more than that, a somewhat sizable share of problem cases are, and I remember someone telling me this about the CPS a long time ago. People in their hours reporting just sometimes add a zero and sometimes delete a zero. It turns out you can get a fair amount of mileage out of getting rid of outliers by kind of comparing wages, comparing an income, and looking for hours ending in zero and seeing that's where that's going on. But not a big deal, because at the end of the day, we end up looking at employment and wages, and then earnings will of course capture employment effects, wage effects, and hours effects, because we include the zeros. So this turns out to be not that important. And I think that's my last data slide. Good, okay. So let me show you some descriptives just to sort of think about what's going on here. Blacks earn lower wages, that's not surprising. But this is even conditioning on skills. So this graph here is, we have 18 or 20 groups floating around in this paper. I'm not going to show you all of them. We do teens, we do male and female teens, then we condition on low education, we condition on low age, and combinations of low education and low age. So I'm just going to kind of flip through examples as I go. The results I'll show you where there is some variation. So this is males, less than or equal to high school, under 30. And these are just nominal wages at the time, just to sort of, you can track everything. And that's the wage gap that probably doesn't surprise anyone. But the point is even conditional on skill, Black wages are lower. So if I run a regression for a low skilled group defined this way, I'm going to find, I might expect minimum wage to have a more negative impact. The one exception is teens. Black and white teen wages kind of overlap pretty closely. I think teens are not a very interesting group for looking at wages, as we say in the notes there. Teens are very heterogeneous. Some teens have already dropped out of high school. Some teens are going to get PhDs. Right, you know, a 25-year-old out of school is we know a lot more about them, or a 28-year-old out of school than we do about just a teenager without conditioning on schooling.
This is a dynamic population of teens in the year, or you're following teens over a certain horizon?
Is this ACS? You get them once a year, and you don't even know which month you get it. ACS does not maddeningly tell you which month the survey is in, which I find weird, but I assume it's a confidentiality issue.
This is earnings conditional on any one of the work.
These are hourly wages. Here I'm showing you hourly wages, just to show you what bindingness means for those. Yeah, I mean, assessing bindingness is always tricky because the minimum wage presumably has created some non-employment, and presumably it's the lowest wage people who are out. So, you know, so black wages may be biased up more than white wages because of that, if the sort of underlying observed productivity is lower. Yes, I don't know your name, sorry.
Could you do something like the previous graph, looking at the share who earn wages below? I assume you're going to exploit reforms where minimum wages are increasing. Could you do something that's like the share that are kind of previously earning below that mark or somewhere near it?
Oh, you mean as like a fraction affected treatment variable?
Yeah.
We haven't done the fraction affected variable. I mean, the problem with that always is, you know, that was sort of first used by Card, I believe. Maybe it was somebody else, you never know. But in a case where there had been no minimum wage increases for a while, so it's kind of a clean measure. In an environment, in this period, minimum wages are kind of going up repeatedly. So I'm not sure there's ever sort of a clean, you weren't affected and now the minimum wage went up and now you would be. But yeah, I haven't, the literature has moved away from using fraction affected, and maybe that's why, maybe not. I'm not exactly sure. It's a good question. Think about it. Okay, so I showed you that. Okay, just some more descriptives. Blacks are younger. This is the age distribution. This doesn't condition on anything. Pretty striking difference, actually. But perhaps not surprising. Less surprising, I think, is the education differences. Right, so the no high school is green. Some colleges, the high school is red, I guess. College is blue. So quite big differences in some college and college going attendance, as well as having less than a high school education or high school, you know, probably high school dropout rates, although you want to be careful calling it that for someone who's 19 years old, maybe. But you have those two differences clearly. Here's just some pictures of wage distributions. These are wage distributions, but they're defined relative to the minimum wage. So the spike is at 1, right? If there's a spike in the minimum wage, the spike is at 1 here. So if you look at everyone, and again, this of course conditions on working, minimum wages are a good deal more binding for blacks. That's just a reflection of the wage difference. When you condition, so this one here is less than or equal to high school, you still see it, a little less sharp perhaps. If you condition even more, so now you're doing males less than or equal to high school, less than 30, you know, if you squint, you could see a bit more bindingness for blacks, but not a lot. So as you narrow the skill group, you tend to find less bindingness of minimum wages, less of a difference across the races, and I'm going to come back to in a different way based on the regressions, that same point so this goes back to your question about, I'm an engineer tenure question, because we sort of think about, is it bindingness? Is it discrimination? This isn't a discrimination paper. It's a residual explanation. Is it something else? Is it industry you're in? And that's because at the end of the day, again, with this caveat that I estimate bindingness for the people for whom I can observe wages, it's not clear that minimum wages are, once I look at narrow low skill groups, that minimum wages are that much more binding. That doesn't seem to be where the greater job loss is predominantly coming from. Hang on, John. John has the other part.
In limited service, restaurants, hospitality, where are these jobs?
I have some industry slides. I'm trying to remember if they have labels or just 2-digit codes on them, but a lot of them are in retail and restaurants. So I'm going to show you some. I mean, that's they're across the board, but a lot of them for both. And the white and black distributions are not very different. We do 2-digit NAICS industry shares for each of these different low skill groups. The correlations are like 0.98 or higher between whites and blacks.
Thinking about this a lot.
Yeah.
Sometimes when there's not an actual control for lady service restaurant and people talk about restaurants employees and giving tips,
Right.
and it's only really a subset of this. It must be in a certain type of establishment where the minimum wage really matter.
Right. So that's right. And I have some work on a much narrower topic, I think, about the tip versus non-tip restaurant sector. And you do find evidence of what you're saying, that tip minimum wages, you know, the quote unquote experiment in there is compare the full service and limited service. Although now we're getting asked to tip everywhere, so those things may break down. I have this question. I've been trying to get to the CEO of Square to figure out whether more and more companies are classifying their workers as tip now, because the standard is actually very low. It's $30 a month. You know, usually when it's a paper cup, you know, they wouldn't know, but now, and of course you can pay a much lower minimum wage. So another topic for another day. Sorry, John.
Trump makes it tax exempt.
Right. Then we're all going to be tipped.
How do you have so many payments to the left of the minimum wage? I thought that's illegal.
It is. I mean, these are computed wages. But even in the CPS, if you look at hourly wages, you see this. I mean, part of it can be tipped, right? In the CPS, you can actually break that out because you kind of get separate measures of what's reported as tips, commissions, and something else, bonuses, which the low skilled workers aren't getting. So some can be a tip sector. There's a tiny uncovered sector. There's family businesses where these don't apply. And these are state minimum wages, and some states have somewhat bigger exemptions. So in some of the state laws, but I would guess that the most of it is poor measurement or non-compliance. In another paper I'm doing, not with these kind of data, much more of a panel data thing, we noticed, not expecting it, that compliance is pretty good, but we're doing something with the SIP where we turn in a monthly data. It kind of takes many months for workers' wages to come up to the newly legislated minimum wages. Now, whether that's reporting or actual, of course, I can't tell because all I see is the report. So it could be some of that short term, but I'm not sure. But it's not unusual, even in the CPS hourly wage data. Again, less clear for teens, not clear at all. Those look virtually indistinguishable. Okay. So what are the key takeaways from wages? Minimum wages are more binding for blacks than whites, which all else the same predicts stronger minimum wage employment effects. Another point is that even when you look, I didn't really mention this, so let me just flip back to one so we have it up here. Let's just look at this one. Even when we look at teens, who are the lowest wage group, there's a lot of workers above the minimum wage. You asked about those below, but there's a large fraction above. And that always means that there's this point that makes that I always try to make when I'm talking about minimum wages, which is that even a group that is very strongly affected, there's a lot of people whose wages are above the minimum wage. So when you think about an employment elasticity, and is this small? Does it, and there's a wage gain, does this imply the group gains? You want to be careful because presumably it's only the low wage people in that group from whom that employment elasticity is being identified, because it's a reduced form elasticity, right? It's the employment effect on the minimum wage. Many aren't affected. So the right employment elasticity to apply to those whose wages are pushed up is probably a much bigger elasticity, kind of roughly speaking, if a third of workers are affected, tripling it, for example. But not so important for here. And there's this caveat. We see observed wages, not counterfactual wages. I had this thought last night. There's this old paper by Meyer and Wise where they estimate employment effects by assuming a parametric wage distribution and, just seeing like what's missing. So I've thought about whether it might make sense. You have to assume a functional form, obviously, to do that here. But that can be problematic. And my guess is that leads us to actually, if anything, overstate how binding minimum wages are for blacks in relative terms, because more of them are sort of cut out of the labor market by the higher minimum wage. Okay, So now let's get into the more the meat of this. This is the locational issue. So this is a graph of residential racial segregation. I show you the 1th and 99th, and then all the 10, 20, 30 deciles here. It's highly nonlinear. And that's what I said before, like at the 10th decile, which is the second point, the share white, this is just doing black and white shares that add to 100. I'm just leaving out other people for this graph, wouldn't be that different. 10th decile is essentially all white, and then you get this sort of the 8th or 9th percentile, and 99th percentile, of course, is almost exclusively black, but it is highly nonlinear, which is important for thinking about the stronger effects of unemployment of blacks and where geographically they're going to be felt. I will say, I should have mentioned this. John asked me before we started, why did you start working on this? I forgot the other reason I started working on this. Now it comes, so I get a lot of calls from reporters about minimum wages, not surprisingly, and occasionally they say, so does that mean we should get rid of the minimum wage? And I've always given the sort of introductory econometrics book answer, the variance of the prediction error is bigger the further we are from the central tendency of the right hand side variables. So I'm willing to say, if you cut the minimum wage 50 cents or $1 or $2 or raised it, I have a pretty good idea what will happen. So I give that answer, and then sometimes when I'm feeling a little more loose tongued, I'll say, but I do wonder, like, what ghetto neighborhoods would look like without a minimum wage. Right, and this is not exactly about that, but and we don't frame it that way in the paper. But I think that is another way to think about motivating this. Okay, blacks live in areas with lower skilled and poorer people, partly because blacks are lower skilled and poor. You can see that there. So, for example, blacks live in places where the poverty rate's about a third higher than where whites live, and high school dropout rates is around 20% higher, etc. So that goes to this question of why effects might differ by place as well. Employment rates are lower in areas with a high share black. So here I'm showing you all employment rates, male less than or equal to high school, just as one example, a very clear downward gradient. It actually is true for, yes. Yes. The employment rate, that's just the employment rate in the PUMA based on the percentile of the black distribution.
That's the vertical scale.
That's the vertical scale.
That's on the horizontal scale, Jack.
That's the percent black in the PUMA. Right, right.
So it's down to, it's hard to read.
It's going from like if I look at the all side, about 0.7 to 0.6.
Down to 50% in the right-hand side of the neighborhood.
Right. Kate, it's dropping from roughly 65 to 50. So pretty dramatic employment differences. I'll come back and show you some of those later. So these neighborhoods are very different. Okay, and then if you do it by race, we kind of get this kind of weird stuff at the beginning, but that's where the black shares are so small. But what's kind of interesting here is white employment. I mean, this happens for both whites and blacks, right? So both white and black employment rates fall. And to some extent, if you look at the less skilled group on the right-hand side, it's actually only the white line that slopes downward. So black employment rates are lower than whites. You can see that in all these graphs, in both these graphs, but they're kind of lower everywhere. And the bigger difference in terms of as you move across PUMAs and go out in area PUMAs with a larger share black is the white employment rate actually declines somewhat more. We have the slide in here. Every time I read it, I keep thinking, how important is this? I'm not exactly sure, but the employment rates, when you convert things to minimum wage elasticities, the baseline employment rate you're using, of course, is influential. So I think it's good to have these in the background. Okay, and then finally, this is I don't like HHIs as labor market concentration, but these are HHI measures based on the National Establishment Time Series data, which is kind of Dun and Bradstreet data, which I've used in other work. I do retail, food and accommodation, and then a larger set of low wage sectors. There's essentially no, and the top panel is the 10th percentile share black. The bottom panel is the 90th percentile. So you might think fewer businesses per workers, higher HHIs in black areas, but you don't really see a clear pattern here. And that may not be true because Black areas are urban, there may be other, there may be more businesses because of higher density. So this was actually one of the thoughts originally. As some of you know, there's a lot of work on monopsony and low wage labor markets and the relationship with minimum wages. So we sort of were interested in whether there was any angle there, but there kind of isn't. So we don't do any more with this. We are in some other work unrelated to the race question. Okay, so now we can get to some. Oh yeah, sure. These are low HHIs. These are scaled to 10,000, right? Yeah, they're really low. Which I mean, it's this data set. I mean, these are computed on different data sets. We're doing some other work on trying to get at this whole monopsony minimum wage thing. We're trying to develop more sensible measures of labor market frictions, like actual flows between jobs, and see what we get. And that's I can't summarize the results yet because we don't know what they are yet. But again, HHIs, I don't know. This is labor market power, product market power, right? And they have opposite predictions for the effects of minimum wages. Okay, so now we can get to the core stuff. So this is just the usual minimum wage employment regression. There's an employment rate on the left-hand side. There's a log minimum wage. X is some demographic controls that might drop out when we disaggregate by those. There's Puma and state dummies. Puma and year dummies. And the only difference here is there's a black dummy. So that could just be one of the X's. So this is just to get a baseline relative to what people have typically done without yet looking at race differences in the employment effects. No, that's actually not too small. Okay. I'm going to walk through a few tables, but I don't really need to bore you with all of them. The bottom line is I've highlighted in gray the standard employment effect. And then I guess I didn't highlight the employment elasticity. Maybe I should have, the second to last column. So, people say when you look at teens, high school dropouts, 16 to 24-year-olds, people, including me, elasticity to -0.1 to -0.2 are kind of what you expect. So these elasticities they're negative for teens. They're small, very small negative. They're on the low side for sure. And the employment effects, this is ACS data, are actually not significant, which is different from what you get in some other data sets. But this is somewhat more recent data than most people have looked at. So the baseline, if you were just doing a minimum wage employment effect kind of standard paper and saying, oh, let me just see what I get in the ACS instead of, a longer spell for the CPS, because the ACS doesn't go back further, you'd say, yeah, it looks, negative, but weaker than what people have found before. And those are not significant, which some people make hay out of, and that's fine. And here's just some other groups. So here we start the bottom ones are more interesting. Here we're doing both education and age. And again, the elasticities they're all staying low. I mean, I don't think there's any in this analysis, which is the whites and blacks combined, where the elasticity is bigger, negative. So it's confusing to say bigger here, than -0.1. So these are low relative to other work, I would say. Okay.
Talk about a space out of which you grow, literally. Sometimes I feel that the study of the minimum wage for teens, white teens.
I agree. Yes.
But for Afro-Americans, perhaps it's a different story. I was curious about.
Well, okay. I mean, it's an interesting question. I have. I remember when sitting at a hearing and we were debating the whole, this is back in like the Card-Kruger stuff, and we got into this whole back and forth on employment effects for teens. And at one point I said what you just said, like, it doesn't really matter what happens here. Like, I mean, if you're throwing 30-year-old single mothers out of work, that's a problem, probably. But we should probably be looking at poverty rates or things like that anyways. I think historically, the reason people focused on teens is we used to not have, when people were doing all the time series stuff, kind of up to the work summarized in the famous Brown et al. Survey, we had time series data. And if you're going to look for minimum, and one of those was 16 to 19-year-olds, like it still is for the BLS off of, if people wanted to think about a group where you might see anything, that was the group they looked at. You didn't have sort of age by schooling breakdowns in the published data. But I agree with microdata, they're less interesting, I think. I mean, you said more important for blacks. I mean, I think the reason they're interesting is I'm less concerned if teens lose their job in the short run. I'm more concerned if it forecloses you from acquiring labor market experience. I have other work that says it does. I'm less concerned if you're in school instead. I'm more concerned if you're just doing neither instead. And I have some work that says that's the outcome. That's older, so maybe that's not true anymore. I haven't yet seen any work that says, you know, we're pushing people out of work, but they're acquiring skills instead. So in that sense, it's a concern. On the other hand, you know, maybe it's efficient. Well, I mean, yeah, it's inefficient in the sense that these people have very, very low productivity of time outside of work. So in that sense, you know, I think I talked about this before. If we had, you know, if I was looking at, like, let's say, mothers with young kids versus teenagers, I'd much rather the teenagers work and the mothers not work from an efficiency perspective, in terms of the value of time.
Not the dependence. Yeah, because a teen with dependent is a different story.
You do know the dependency. There aren't going to be many of those. I mean, childbearing is low, but yeah, you do know that. I haven't done anything with family records except the number of children variables. Okay. So now we turn to what is, you know, in some sense the most interesting, which is putting in these Black interactions. So what we're doing, this is a fully interactive model. I could just as well run two separate models for whites and blacks. Just makes it nice and easy to test for differences across coefficients here. Everything's interactive, the controls, the minimum wage, the dummies, and all that. You know, how to interpret the coefficients in terms of identification. Well, I'll talk more about this later, but you know, the whole debate with Aaron Dubé and all these folks is about, are there correlated shocks that are confounding minimum wage effects? Won't get into all those details here, but if you think the shocks are the same for whites and blacks, then at least the relative effects you're estimating for blacks are reliable, and maybe the white coefficients are picking up both effects of minimum wages and whatever else is correlated with the shocks. If you read this about Casey and Minton's paper, just came out, the NBR Sunday paper about what they call in the macro context, they call the missing intercept, right? Which the point being that, you know, all these strategies only estimate relative effects, and unless you're willing to take a strong stand on no confounders, I don't know that the beta is actually the coefficient for whites. I'm not that interested in that in this paper.
Let me just understand the conversion. So there's no diff and dip here. This is just a panel data set, and the unit of observation is a person at a year. Is that right?
Everything is right except it's a triple diff actually, right? So the previous regression it's a diff and diff because minimum wages are changing differentially, right? You're always asked, I mean, it's not a simple dummy to the minimum wage increase, but I mean, a panel data with policy changes is essentially, it's two-way fixed effects, but I always. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Sorry, you're right. I should leave those out here. I don't know why I left those out here. Yeah, we have individuals by Puma. Think of it as state, so it's no less confusing, and year, right? So minimum wages are changing differentially over time. So you're identifying the effect of minimum, you know, how differently employment is changing for people with the same X's, and then you're getting and they're changing a lot in this period. I'll show you, and they're changing a lot. And then I'm doing the triple diff because it's once you put in the minimum wage times black, there's a differential effect for blacks versus whites.
Regression is just the unit is a person.
Yes.
So minimum wage applies to that person.
At that place, in that Puma at that point in time, right? I could just as well you know, you could do this aggregated to the state to the Puma by period level. Yeah. Sorry, I don't know why I left the subscripts off here.
David, sorry, I'm
yeah.
conveniently sitting behind you. So, but there are no individual fixed effects in here, right? So,
you can't. I mean, there's no repeated observations.
Exactly.
It's the ACS.
Exactly.
Right.
So it's a two-way fixed effects model, but in the sense that you would have Puma fixed effects and time fixed effects.
Yeah. And, which is why I say I could aggregate, and then I could construct the controls as shares, and you'd get very similar results.
Is it possible to do the same as an event study?
Well, I mean, I'm gonna. This is a whole nother debate. We were talking about the JP micro paper, which is all about this. I mean, there's a lot of events here, and there aren't a lot of clean events. But I'm going to come back to some of these issues and show you a pseudo version of that post 2010, where now I can talk about a bunch of never treated states, and you get a very nice visual display of what's going on. Actually,
Standard wage, standard wage.
I mean, you could aggregate them. You could aggregate them by period of geography.
So alpha has time fixed effects and place fixed effects.
Well, those are the the DPs and the DTs. Alpha here is just an intercept, sorry. Pumas are Puma dummies, the DT are Puma dummies, and the DT are time dummies. Okay, and they all differ by race. They can differ by race.
So you're gonna cluster standard errors at state level?
I believe we do it at the Puma level because the variation, there's a fair amount of local minimum wage variation these days.
Okay.
I don't think it matters. Jyotsana, did we do Puma or state? Do you remember? I can't actually recall sitting here.
We do state.
Clustering.
We do state.
Oh, yes.
One question in the back of my mind, when
Sure.
everybody talks about minimum wages, that minimum wage is a nominal thing. And yet, cost of living, wage rates, et cetera, differ a great deal across the country. Even within the state of California, which recently had some minimum wage changes, the impact of a minimum wage increase around here is probably zilch, but much more likely to be significant in the valley. Now, does any of this is controlled here? I presume not.
Well, there's no, I mean, in the older minimum wage literature, which sort of grew up in the late 80s, there's a lot more inflation. And well, until recently there was more, but not as much as then. So people were typically using some kind of normalized minimum wage, so what I call it, Cates index. You know, so here we're not explicitly measuring any of that variation within Puma and year, but the Puma dummies and the time, I mean, you'll get both the cross sectional and the time series.
Puma dummies will sort of capture.
That'll do like San Francisco versus Central Valley, unless somehow there's changes.
That will
yeah, that'll sweep that out.
My concern.
Yeah, any price index, any, you know, because it's a log minimum wage, so any price index that varies only by Puma or only time will get fully absorbed in those. Okay.
Except not the interaction.
Not the interactions, right? There's differential changes, right? That's why people used to divide by sort of a wage level, but kind of with at least the subsidence of inflation for a long time, people stopped doing that. Yeah, but yeah. Okay, so this is now, in some sense, core result, although there's a lot more, I promise you. So now you're getting the employment effect for whites, that's the beta, and this is the black minimum wage interaction. That's the overall effect, which is just the sum of these two things. So now you can see the big difference. The white employment effect, let's say teens, minus 0.014, for blacks, minus 0.064, significant at the 5% level. And if you jump over to elasticities, minus 0.039 for whites, you know, close to zero for sure, all negative, but minus 0.283 for blacks. It's a big difference. Male teens, minus 0.353, female teens, minus 0.249. We tend to see that pattern. I don't know in every single case, but we tend to see more of this for black men than for black women, which I think doesn't surprise some people because race differences in earnings between women are smaller than race differences in earnings between men, which may speak to productivity, which, by the way, is the exact opposite of what people mean when they talk about intersectional discrimination. I have another paper on that we can't find any evidence of intersectional discrimination, even though half the papers in literature claim it's there. Okay, anyways, that's an aside. When we just do age, I mean, you're always finding differences, but when we do age by schooling, which is this slide here, sorry, it gets kind of crowded. You know, so now you've got a sharper low school group, high school dropouts under 30, you know, there's a whole bunch of alternatives here. You see a lot of zeros for whites effectively, and elasticities. I think the biggest one here is this one right here, minus 0.418. Get these big elasticities for blacks, and again, typically somewhat bigger, not significantly so, for men than for women. That is, in some sense, you know, the simple first punchline and maybe the main punchline of the paper. And this was, you know, Jyotsana and I had this result probably in March, and I kept saying you did something wrong, but she didn't. I didn't. We didn't.
Just in terms of interpreting this, so this could partly just reflect the figures you showed earlier. There's a much bigger density of black workers below minimum wages, right? And so
yes, although it's
two things, both
yes,
a risk and then potentially you think that the actual elasticity of them is different for blacks and whites, right?
Right, that's right. And I mean, the paper's not fully about mechanism. We try to say something about that. Remember the one-side condition on this, you may not remember this because I'm showing you a lot of stuff, I realize. But one-side condition on both education and age there's just the spike difference is a lot milder. I'm going to show you a figure later after I zip through the spatial stuff. That's going to make really clear that insofar as you can tell, because I'm looking at observed wages, you get. I'll jump to it now, and I'll jump back because it's kind of a striking graph. Since I've got these arrows mastered, I just want to show you this. So this is this is going to be a summary of what we do when we estimate effects. The bottom line is we estimate effects by these deciles of share by percent share black, and the estimates. There are, so there's, I like this graph. I like lots of dimensions of graphs, but I know I have to stop for a second and say, what the hell is going on in this graph? But I remember, okay, so the black, these here are the black estimates and confidence intervals of the employment effect. This is for male high school dropouts. This is less than high school under 30. So there's the black elasticities, in this case down in the O minus 0.3 range, generally significant. Not much change, that's what I said, across the distribution of share black in the Puma. The white estimates are right near zero. You can see them there because they have dots and confidence intervals. And these are the shares white declining and the share black increasing. So that's that same figure I showed you, that nonlinearity of the segregation.
No, it's interesting in terms of mechanisms because the kind of a risk mechanism is very clear that just mechanically.
Right, but I want to show you one of the graphs, and then I'm going to show you one of the graph that gets directly at what you're saying, and then I'm going to back up. So this is the one that I think is the clearest. So here I'm showing you a lot of groups. This again isn't all of them because it's just too many to crowd in. So what I'm showing you here, the blue bars are the proportion whose wages are under 110% of the minimum wage. So here's teens, pair of blue bars, pair of blue bars, pair of blue bars. Notice each of those pairs kind of the same height, a little higher for blacks, a little more binding, some cases, but here not. And the reds are the estimates. The close to zeros for whites, big negatives for blacks. I look at this and say, again, with the caveat that they're observed wages, I'm not, and which might be important. I mean, I'm sure qualitative, I know which direction it goes. I don't know how big it is. You're not seeing this, at least in terms of observed bindingness among those still working. That's, these differences seem very unlikely to explain these differences. It's kind of what I'm getting at.
Interesting in terms of the mechanisms, right? Because theories of discrimination might explain why wages are lower for one group than another. But if it's not driven by the sort of differential exposure, it's a theory of discrimination where the elasticity of employment with respect to wages is different, and that's a more subtle moment. So it's interesting thinking, what do your findings imply for theories of discrimination or other reasons why?
Right. So we come down on lightly, because we don't have direct evidence, on discrimination is probably the most plausible explanation. Remember, so we used to think about wages. But in a minimum wage world, that's not the right way to think about it, because minimum wage provides a floor, right? So if I have a minimum wage that binds me, and I would have, in a classic backer employer model, would have paid the minorities less, I can't. So instead I don't hire them. And that sort of also undoes the competition effects that might without discrimination. But let's get back to that, because I jumped ahead just to show you that.
Back to C1. So it could be, let's say the lower, but let me try. So a lower level of education means a lower degree of portability of human capital. So a minimum wage increases the relative price of certain types of workers versus others. And a person with higher human capital who we happen to identify with more likely to be white.
Right. This could all be unobserved. I mean, it could all be unobserved human capital. Oh, yeah. Right. I mean, unobserved. Right. Yeah. We talk unobserved school quality differences. I don't know how important. I mean, I'm sure they exist. I'm sure they're in that direction. I just don't have a good handle on how big they are, and I want to be careful not to assume they're really big, because maybe they're not that big. I don't know. There's a stereotype. But yeah, that could. We talk about that as well. I mean, just a condition on age and education. I mean, age is measured correctly, presumably, but the same years of education can mean different things for blacks and whites. Although I would have thought that the whites in black areas, well, they may not be going to the same schools, but in a sense, you're not finding bigger employment effects in the poor, I'm calling it, in the high share black areas. And if it's all school quality and the whites are still going to the same schools, and maybe they're not, maybe they go to Catholic schools in black areas, so it could be more complicated. You might expect some differences across areas in minimum wage elasticities. But again, I'm not sure, and we're speculating on those things. I mean, this opens up a lot of questions, which I hadn't anticipated getting into, but I probably will because it's kind of interesting. Okay, so here's where we just, I skipped over the regression, but I think it's obvious. I'll just show you here. Now we also add interactions of everything with the percent black and the puma. So now I've got a white effect, an interaction for blacks and whites, and a interaction of the minimum wage effect with the percent black. And what I'm showing you here, it's interaction now, so there's a lot of coefficients. So I'm showing you here these sets of estimates at the 10th, 50th, and 90th percentile. And if you come to either the white or the black employment elasticities by that percentile, they just don't differ that much. It's kind of the graph I showed you before. Those estimates were, pretty flat, maybe a bit of a increasing negative estimate, like here it gets a little more negative. But these are not differences I would write home about. The black-white employment elasticity differences are not that different across low share black and high share black areas. So that's where we sort of ended up saying there's not a lot going on here, and I just have a lot more of these tables, and they'll say the same thing. So that's how I got to this graph. That was the summary of that graph. I want to make the point though that doesn't mean black areas aren't hit hardest. They're hit really hard because that's where blacks live. Blacks are hit, and blacks live in black areas. If there's no residential segregation, that wouldn't be the case, but there's extreme residential segregation. So this is just sort of a simulation is too fancy a word. Back of the envelope calculation is probably more accurate. So all we do here is we take the oh God, it doesn't say it anywhere on here. We just made this figure. This is black high schooler under 30 years old, right, Jyotsana? Yeah, okay. We were making this table yesterday and we left out that importantly, but we're using the estimates for them. So, and this is like the estimates where we don't have effects that differ by percent black, and here we do. That doesn't matter much. But let me just show you what goes on here. So here's just the white population share at the 10th percentile black. It's almost 100% or 1. Almost no blacks. At the 90th percentile of the share black, the black share is 0.56. I mean, the 99th, of course, would be a lot higher. So population shares, not surprisingly, differ a lot. Employment rates, you can see they're lower for blacks everywhere and then for whites. But the gradient, I showed you that figure before, is steeper for whites than for blacks. Okay. Then we have a weighted employment rate. And here we have the elasticities for whites and for blacks. And these are different in the two columns because you're applying them to slightly different employment rates. Okay. I meant to walk through this. Sorry. All right. Color coded. There you go. So there's the employment rates. There's the elasticities. And this last row is what happens to the employment rate. What I do here is a 7.25. That's the federal minimum to 12. That was the California minimum when the data ended, 2019. A lot of states are above 12 and not just the old coastal liberal states anymore. I mean, this is not at all uncommon. So this is sort of saying whereas like 22 or so states, this changes every January 1st now, are still at the federal minimum. So this is sort of a pretty close now to a representative minimum wage increase, right? And perhaps even on the low side. And what this says is that in white areas, the sort of simulated effect on the employment rate is close to 0 because you're applying the small elasticities to people who are mainly white. One second. In black areas, the employment rate from that, it would be lower by 3 percentage points on a difference of 12.1 if I'm doing the math right. So if you take this back of the envelope calculation a little seriously, these kinds of minimum wage variations, which exist now across states, even bigger, they're not the whole difference for the employment rate difference. And I'm sure there's a lot of other factors in these neighborhoods, but this is a pretty big share of 12. It's 25% of it, which says these minimum wage effects in areas with a high share black can be playing a significant role in how much lower employment is in those areas. You get a question?
Sorry if I missed this earlier. So these are employment rates for people with education lower than a high school degree. You're removing from this employment rate people who are enrolled in school?
No, but these are not just teenagers, right? So that's very few people. I mean, under 30.
But maybe in the category of less education than a high school graduate. And if you go to your figure on slide 50.
I'm not sure why. I mean, sorry, which one? Sorry.
Slide 50.
Yeah.
It looks like most of the effect for less than a high school degree under 30 is being driven by
Less than high school, and let's just get everyone on the same bar. Less than high school under 30 right here.
The red bars are much smaller for all of the age categories under over teenagers. So if the
You're
bars under-
comparing these three. Okay, so just to because
so if the bars
let me
under-
just get everyone caught up here. Let me just get everyone caught up. So these are people who have less than a high school degree when we observe them, and they're under age 30, all gender and by gender. And these are the teens. And you're saying these elasticities are bigger than these.
So they're closer. So
Closer to what?
so sorry. The elasticities for the group under 30 with less than a high school education is much closer to the elasticity estimates for teens than it is for people who are over 19, suggesting that if this is kind of a weighted average of individuals who are teenagers and in their 20s, to get that aggregate effect, it's got to be driven by the teenagers.
Quite sure why it can't be driven by the 19 to 30-year-olds. Yeah, I mean, I take your. I'm not sure that's right, but I'm not saying I'm not sure it's not right either. So I'm being non-committal. But I think I mean, you could leave out the enrolled. I'm not sure you should. I mean, a lot of people in school at these ages also work. I actually my original. This is going back a long time. This is my earliest PTSD in the minimum wage literature was I got skewered for leaving out the enrolled people by Cardcats and Kruger. But let me think about it. I mean, I mean, it couldn't hurt to do that to see if it looks any different. Certainly, yeah. I'm not. I have to think more about what exactly I'd make of it, but that makes sense. Okay. Yes.
Going back to not this part, an interesting follow-up would be to see what happens to the crime rate in predominantly Black neighborhoods after an increase in the minimum wage.
Yeah. So, I don't think it's. I mean, there are some papers on minimum wages and crime. I don't know if there's any at the Puma. I published this. So I get a lot of emails with minimum wage papers. I'm sure you get, this happens to all of us depending on what we work on, right? And I started getting all these papers on minimum wages and like heart attack rates and suicides and all kinds of things. And I said, what is going on? A lot of them are public health journals. And some of them are, I said, I'm going to just write a survey paper on what all these papers are saying. And I don't know where I'm going to publish it, but I actually publish it in Labor, which is an okay labor journal. And I call it the effects of minimum wages on parentheses, almost everything. And crime, it's like health and risky behaviors kind of thing. And crime is actually one of those where there's conflicting evidence, but I kind of think the best evidence says you do get some increases in crime. Joe Gebbia at San Diego State has done probably some of the best work on that. It's never been tied to race. You want to get me in more trouble, right? Yeah, no, it's right.
Well, it's also
No, it's an interesting question, and it should be local.
so it also helps support your employment.
Right. I mean, you would think that would be a somewhat local effect. And then people are doing things like you expect, like, property crime. I mean, you're probably not murdering people because of minimum wage, but you might be stealing money. So, or stealing things you can get money for. Yeah, that's an interesting point.
Or joining gangs.
Right.
The murder rate could go up.
True. But I think these papers tend to say we're going to sort of control for other changes by focusing on the pecuniary. This is common. This is kind of the pecuniary motivations for crime. But you're right. Okay. So here I just want to show you some evidence. Yes, sorry.
Sorry, one more inconvenient question from behind.
No problem.
About parallel trends. So I guess.
Oh, I skipped. Did I? Oh, no, that's coming. Wait, hang on. Did I skip? Wait a second. Oh, I did skip over that because why did I skip over that? I don't know why I skipped over that. Sorry. Yes. I got a question and yes. Let me come back to yes. Okay. So this is what you want to know about, right?
Yeah, let's see. I don't know.
Okay. Yes. Let me go. Okay. So, as everyone, if you're a minimum wage worker under 30, this is bad news, but as every PhD student and professor under 30 knows, there's all these different concerns. And depending on your age, you worry about this more or less, as far as I can tell from the regressions I've been running. But what it does highlight is there are potential problems with the panel data that people, according to this literature, people hadn't thought about before. I think that's completely inaccurate. I think people have often said, What if I leave out? What if I compare early adopters and late adopters? What if I, look at only the ever treated? I think what this has done is systematize what people do instead of pointing out this. There's this paradigm in this literature where people are stupidly putting in a dummy and running a diff and diff and not thinking about the data at all. And that's not how people do research. But anyways, you can't ignore these issues anymore. So now our first line of defense is we're looking at race differences. So unless you have sort of differential pre-trends or something by race, this stuff should be netted out, right? Of course, they could differ by race. So that's an identifying assumption you could make. The key concern is what I say right here, was Black employment in treated areas falling in relative terms before the minimum wage increases. I mean, that's in some sense the bottom line source of confounder you're worried about. So we did two things. One is, even though estimating leads and lags is not 100% kosher in this literature, but I still think it's informative. We do that. We can't use a lot of them. It's not that long a panel. We have to go to the state level because there's the PUMA's change mid-sample. So we go to the state level instead of PUMA level. That doesn't affect the estimates. So then we do sort of some long-ish leads and lags. There's no clear evidence of pre-treatment changes for Blacks relative to whites. I think more interesting, though, is because I think it's cleaner to what this literature tries to do. And I have to say, I've been involved in a bunch of debates over this stuff in other research. And I kind of feel like what we're ending up doing is visual econometrics instead of formal econometrics to figure this out, which maybe isn't a bad thing, to actually look at the data. Yeah, ocular, sorry, not visual. That's a scientific term. Okay. So what we do is we take the sub-period post-Great Recession, 2011 to 19. Why? Because there were federal increases in 07, 08, and 09. So then you have a bunch of states with no changes after that, either because they were at the federal or a few that were higher but didn't change. And then because there were these federal changes, a lot of states, even the one states that like high minimum wages, were kind of okay for a while, but then they started raising the minimum wages later. So you have a never treated group of states, and you have a bunch of other states where there's sort of no higher minimum wages, no changes, but then they start to roll out minimum wage increases. And that gives you a nice way to look at kind of pre-trends and also kind of see how things are changing for these states that are cumulatively rolling out more and more minimum wage increases from 2011 to 2019 relative to the other states. And let me show you what happens here. It's pretty interesting. I don't know which graph is easier to read, so I'll show you a couple. This is, and again, there's a bunch of these. Here's some examples. These are teens. So at 2011, 2019, I'm showing you white and Black. That's the two lines up here and two lines down here, employment rates over time. The reds are the never treated. These are whatever it is, 22 states, 25, well, 4, whatever it is, that never changed the minimum wage. These are the dashed lines are the ever treated. And you can see here the number of states this is the number of minimum wage increases by year. It's not the cumulative number because you can see it goes down. So there's, as you get later in this period, you have more and more states that have raised the minimum wage. Some of these are new, some of these are repeat increases in the same state. So what do you see here? First of all, if you look at the Black employment rate in the never treated versus ever treated, I mean, I don't see any, in this first few years, any differential trend there. Like this is ocular, I realize. The other thing you see if you peer hard, it's easier in the next graph, is that these lines kind of stay parallel. Like that's the nothing happening to whites when the minimum wage goes up in the ever treated versus the never treated. But what happens here? Well, the ever treated, as the minimum wages start to accumulate, fall below the never treated, right? Which is an adverse minimum wage effect. If you turn this into differences, but these are now race differences, never treated, ever treated, you can see again, there's, if you want to call this, I don't know what the pre-treatment period is exactly, but this period, there's no differential slope here. And then again, what you see here is the red line is going up. So the Black-white difference is narrowing in this period. Now, what's going on in this period? 16 to 19, a huge economic boom, right? What happens in economic booms? Minorities catch up, right? We see that every time. We saw that in the Clinton boom. We saw it in the Trump boom. I hate to name booms after presidents because it's never their credit, but whatever, it doesn't matter. That's what happens in booms, right? There's old George Perry Brookings paper about this. So in the never treated states, as the economy is tightening, remember, this is the Black minus white difference, right? The Black-white employment gap is shrinking. In the ever treated states, nothing's happening. They're not getting that benefit. If you look at male high school under 30 male less than high school under 30, you kind of see again, these look pretty good to me. And again, you see the sort of gap closing during the boom, and this is actually going the other direction. And I think there's one more. This one's kind of extreme. I'm not sure I quite believe this kind of decline, but same qualitative picture. So I think the picture here is, this is sort of a nice period. It's a cleaner experiment. It's a bit more immune from some of the problems this literature identifies. I mean, we could do it. Can't do an event study. It could do this econometrically, but I think the graph is pretty telling. And you kind of have this Trump period boom where things are improving for blacks relative to whites, but it ain't happening, and maybe it's even reversing in the states that are raising the minimum wages a lot. Yeah.
And two questions. One, a similar dynamic question. It looks like we're just saying minimum wage, boom, employment. But if this takes time, it takes time to put in the self-ordered whatever.
Right.
Then there's a dynamic, and you would never catch that dynamic effect. So you're assuming it's the same effect instantly without dynamics, right?
I'm not estimating lag models here. There is work that says that happens. I don't know if I have the riches here, and I think it happens in some job. I'm embarrassed that I went to McDonald's for coffee yesterday because I was driving and I really wanted a coffee. And they don't even have, you can't even order at the counter. You can't order at the counter. And I have a PhD and I could not figure out how to work the machine. It was really, there were two homeless people in there who knew how to work the machine, right? It was a little embarrassing.
So of the decline in employment, what happens? This is partly dynamic too. I mean, they can't just sit there for the rest of their lives. But is move out one of the reactions, or is
geographically move out? Yeah. I mean, right.
You're prime age man. What are you gonna do for the rest of your life?
Well, I mean, mobility is a potential response. I mean, I have to say, I've worked on papers and of course read a lot more on local policies from welfare to minimum wages or whatever. And my sense is mobility responses. There's just not that much interstate mobility. Right. Yeah. It's employment. It's an employment population ratio. So population move.
So moving out of the bad area is not going to help the employment number.
Well, no. If the jobless people go somewhere else, then the people with jobs stay. The employment population ratio would go up, right?
Observations of person.
I'm sorry. Here it's the employment. Yeah, sorry, but still the employment. Yeah, but if the non-employed, it's not a rate. It's a dummy for the employed. But if the non-employed move out in response to the minimum wage, I mean that's gonna give you it's gonna bias the estimate towards zero. Yeah, that's gonna bias the estimate towards zero. But we know there's a lot of non-employment in place. I mean, the Austin Glazer Summers paper is all about that. I mentioned this earlier work I did, which I kind of hope someone else redoes it because I don't want to redo it. Which is you look at sort of younger people. Back to your question about enrollment, you're there in school and employed, only one, only the other, or neither, which we call idle. And just you do see more people who are just idle after the minimum wage goes up. Now maybe it's illicit activity, maybe it's informal activity. That's why I think for the Hispanics, I'm a little more reluctant to kind of play this game because there's a lot of informal work.
Part of the frustration with just elasticity concept, which isn't either preferences or technology, is some people substitute out of work and go back to school for a little while. Other people don't.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of what we're doing.
My guess is a lot of this population. I mean, I haven't done idleness regressions. I think we could, and I bet we'd find that, but it's a good question.
You exclude the ones who are employed in a family firm and all of those?
Not for employment. No, this is all, so that's all in here, only for wages. Okay.
So given that the debate 30, 40 years long is, so to speak, about this so-called first stage, we're talking about it a little bit.
100, there's papers from the 20s.
So to you,
you had a question before I did. I forgot. Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead, Elena.
Where do you think the literature the best, so to speak? Some of the literature that you like, where do you think is converging to?
You're asking.
Spatial controls, cross-county.
Yeah.
To the non-minimum wage obsessed among all of us. There are issues of measure, fundamental issue of measurement.
What do I think is converging in terms of answer or methods?
Where is the issue? how to identify, control population, how to measure.
Yeah. So
the measurement, where do you think the literature is moving from?
I mean, I kind of think, first of all, you're asking the wrong person, obviously, because I have skin in the game. But I do think the debate on whether there's job loss is or should be regarded as kind of over. There is some job loss. There's no, I mean, it's just few studies that don't find it, and I think the major ones have problems. I think the spatial control thing has turned out to be misleading and not convincing, because I mean, the people who raised that, who first said, you know, minimum wage variation isn't really random, so we should think about, when we run panel data models, thinking about what drives the variation. But the spatial, you know, a lot of other approaches aside from the spatial approach, I talked about this classical liberalism seminar a bit. All the other ways of getting at that kind of replicate the negative employment effects. The spatial one doesn't, and I think there's reasons why. So that's my sense. But I'm going to Bob's question.
Just to comment that, oh, all right. The labor economists are only allowed to think about EPOP, the employment population ratio. It's against the rules of labor economics. I've seen this over and over and over in my career as a macroeconomist interested in labor markets. But you know, unemployment is something to be taken seriously, and it's something that you miss if you look at EPOP.
Oh, yeah.
But you did mention one paper that takes my position, the one with Larry Summers. He's always been properly tuned in this. Could I ask you? Oh, that's not a question. That's just a comment.
I thought Larry I mean, I seem to remember him saying that, you know, unemployment out of the labor force are not very well defined, because people move. He has this famous paper with somebody, Kim, that people just move back and forth month to month. If you look at outcome rotation, that's
what unemployment is about.
No. But I mean that whether you're searching or not is makes you unemployed or not. And I think so. I mean, I'm not appealing his paper. Right? I wasn't sure he was so clearly focused on unemployment as the most important concept. But I do think that the reason the labor economists have moved away from unemployment, it goes back to this early Mincer paper from the mid-70s, where it's a precursor to, you know, search models, which of course gotten much more complicated since then. But he's just sort of weighing the probability of finding a job multiplied by the wage of that job, and says people may, depending on what they think, search more, search less, and the unemployment rate, you know, even though jobs fall, the unemployment rate could go up or could go down depending on search responses. So that's, I think, why, you know, people are focused on employment.
There's one question.
I'm doing a search paper now with
go ahead.
but that's for another day.
Oh, go ahead.
I find the paper fascinating, and there's one question that I think you could address that you've been unable to until now, and that's whether or not it's human capital or discrimination. It's come up in the conversation, and you're saying you can't choose between the two, but you could if you could get information, which is publicly available, for every school by race. So we know what the test scores are in 8th grade or high school or whatever grade level you want to pick. We know what the proficiency rates are in the different states. You can norm that on national data. So you could have an estimate of the differential between white human capital and black human capital. And you could, it'd be a lot of work, but you could connect that to your PUMA data. And then you could actually get an estimate, I think. So
no, you're right. I mean, Valerie was saying this before, you know, school, I mean, we're not completely blind about school quality anymore. There's a lot of data being produced. And
the
at least
school quality data, you can't use expenditures and all that kind of stuff, which is what you usually.
No, I mean, I'm doing that I'm thinking of output or value added or something, right? I guess output is So the right. You know, I'm conditioning on education.
Just level data. You don't need the value added data. You just need level data, because that gives you an estimate of human capital.
Right. You want a proficiency difference conditional on observable levels of schooling. Yeah, I agree. It's a great idea. Yeah, let me just say a couple things. I'm not going to get through everything. I won't even get to my concluding slide, but I did want to just say real quickly, I had this slide up here which I just want to say something about, and then show you one more table. Okay, so these are just, there's a bunch of these, but this is just, we take all the groups, we throw them on a graph with the wage elasticities and the employment elasticities, and they're, you can't see here, but they're dark when they're significant and not when they're not. And what you see here is the wage elasticities, if you go along the horizontal axis, they're kind of in the same place, more or less. The whites are actually slightly higher on average. The employment elasticities are really different, right? The white, these are the same scale, right? So that's the close to zero white employment elasticities. These wage, the other thing you see on the right-hand side is the wage elasticities and the employment elasticities are roughly speaking the same order of magnitude, whereas people have tended to think wage elasticities are bigger, and therefore even if minimum wages cause some job loss, earnings don't fall or maybe even rise. I just want to show you, so the suggestion from that is earnings of blacks fall. I just want to show you the table. We're skipping the stuff, we sort of talked about it. This is just effects on earnings. So these are the same regressions. We have a white and black earnings elasticity. The white elasticities are either 0 or positive. There's a couple cases here. There's other tables. So that's, 0 or somewhat positive. For blacks, you're getting these pretty big, here's the teen earning elasticity. They're kind of -0.4, -0.5, which are huge. Here's the age by education is this one. Again, you do the age by education, all this 30, high school, et cetera. Again, you're seeing some elasticities in the -0.1, -0.2, up to -0.5 range. So, people say when they see, even if you say, okay, I'll acknowledge there's some job loss from minimum wages, but people earn more, it's still a good policy. One of my co-authors got in an argument with Michael Reich, and he's like, look, there's other things we should do to help poor people, but none of that's going to happen these days. So this is our best tool. Well, if earnings are falling, it's not your best tool. It's a pretty bad tool. So let me stop there because we're out of time. Thank you.